Good afternoon, Mark South, HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane and Hurricane HD video blog for Monday, August 20th, 2012. A look as we start things off at sea surface temperature anomalies shows that we have quite a warm Pacific now. All the way out here to the central Pacific, things have warmed as this El Nino projected for the year starts to come on. And you can also see, though, a pretty substantial area of very cold water compared to normal in a small area, but it's very much below normal. A little bit of upwelling going on through here. This out here, though, warm, but not significantly above normal. We're not talking about a super El Nino where it's just overwhelming the pattern, but nonetheless the Pacific starting to warm pretty substantially across a wider area anyway, and that could put the brakes on the hurricane season for the Atlantic later in September, even though it seems the brakes are on right now, which I'll show you. The Atlantic as a whole, warmer than normal across most areas. Nothing that really jumps out except the northwest Atlantic basin, quite a bit above normal sea surface temperature wise. If we were to get a hurricane to turn and come up the east coast and affect New England or the Canadian Maritimes, this would come into play because your water is above normal, so the hurricane would perhaps weaken slower as it moves into those lower latitudes. You can also see, because of this warm water anomaly up here, that Gordon had a pretty easy time of maintaining hurricane intensity as it moved through the Azores, which are right there, where water temperatures are below normal now. And if we look at this next week, and maybe even later this week, I'll show you, there'll be a cold water wake right through here where Gordon churned up the Atlantic, knocking down those sea surface temperatures. The actual heat content in the ocean, the true measure of how much energy is out there, this area is starting to fill in a little bit more. If you remember last week, it had a nice C shape to it, sort of carved out here of low heat content values. Now that's starting to increase. The highest heat content, of course, sitting here in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The tropical wave that we're watching, 94L, sitting out here, just about a day away from moving into this higher heat content, so we will see if that starts to affect it. I doubt it, because looking at the satellite picture, I tell you, it's a good thing that there's a lot of dry air and general lack of instability out here, because this is a very large envelope of energy, as you can clearly see, and it would be a formidable hurricane by now if it only had more moisture to work with. That is the only missing ingredient. It is moving at a pretty fast clip to the west, but that in and of itself not really hindering development. It's the lack of moisture. And if we look at the water vapor image here, you can see all of this is dry air out ahead of it and around it to its north. Only down to the south here is it able to tap any moisture, and anytime it tries to expand and develop deep convection, that convection goes up and it pulls air in from around it, and that air is mostly dry, so it pulls that dry air in, and then the convection goes back down. So it's really struggling, and I think it's going to continue to struggle until at least it gets to 50 west here, and maybe even 55 west, where that heat content starts to go up. So I don't see much of a threat from this for the islands, the Leeward Islands, except maybe tropical storm conditions here over the next few days. But even that is maybe stretching it. Keep in mind, though, that even a strong tropical wave, such as what we do have, can bring gusty winds, showers, thunderstorms. If you live down there, you already know that. Then we have 95L here in the western Gulf. Some potential for this to develop. We'll watch it as this front drapes across the region. That acts too as a focusing mechanism. We'll see what happens with this. Not much chance for development overall. The GFS, other computer models, not too enthusiastic about it for whatever reason. You know, maybe it's proximity to land. There is a lot of dry air to its north and west over the United States. And it's just not in the cards, it doesn't look like, for this system to develop. Interesting, though, about 94L, this is the computer guidance from the National Hurricane Center from this morning, and I was looking at the ship's model here. the statistical hurricane intensity prediction. And this is not a dynamic model, mind you, but more of a statistical model for intensity. And look, in 5 days it shows it getting to 100 knots. And that's a major hurricane. In fact, it makes it a hurricane, almost anyway, at 63 knots. A hurricane is 64 in 48 hours. And then a 100-mile-per-hour Cat 2 in 72 hours. Now, I just don't see that happening because of all that dry air and stable air sitting out there. Now, if we lower it even by half, if we take it 50%, and we say, okay, this would be 31 knots or so, 31 and a half, 85 knots, etc. 100 knots would be 50 knots if we took that in half. So that's a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm. I think maybe we could reasonably assume that it could become a tropical storm after it passes the islands, if not before. But what this is telling me is that the ship's model does see a favorable environment in terms of wind shear and sea surface temperatures. Unfortunately, I don't think it really knows enough about the vertical instability issues, and it's missing that key ingredient in here, and that's why you see this pretty quick ramp up to 40 knots in 24 hours, 51, 63, 85, 96, and 100. Pretty overdoing it, I think. You better hope so, because that would be a formidable hurricane passing through the Caribbean. I just don't see that happening. We'll see what the Hurricane Center says on their next update. Looking at the GFS, today's run, this is valid tomorrow morning, and we're looking at the 5,000 foot level. And again, I'm trying to find that vorticity, which is right there. How round is it? How concentrated is it? And then how much is there? If we go up the scale, the more the gradation of colors here, the more vorticity or energy is in the atmosphere, and that equates to a more strong system, a stronger system. So this is valid tomorrow morning. This is valid in 48 hours, so this will be Wednesday morning. It starts to approach the northern Caribbean islands here. Finally, on Thursday morning, it starts getting tangled up over Puerto Rico, Friday, Hispaniola, and then finally 5 days out, Saturday, it's tangled up over Cuba. Now, this reminds me a lot of Ernesto in 2006. You remember that? It came on through here a little bit further north, and then it finally impacted Florida. Very, very weak. It came up and then hit North Carolina almost as a hurricane, bringing hurricane force winds to the Virginia Capes as it got up that way, because back then the water temperatures in 2006 were above normal off the Atlantic coast there, and it was stronger north of 30 degrees of latitude here than it was down in the deep tropics. Will that happen with this system, which would be Isaac, as long as it gets named fairly soon and something else doesn't first? That's possible. We'll have to watch and see. Now, one of the things I like to look at, okay, we can see it showing up at 5,000 feet or 850 millibars in the atmosphere. That's 5,000 feet above the surface. You can see the rotation, the vorticity there, easy to spot. But what about 500 millibars, another layer up in the atmosphere? No, it's not there. It doesn't even show up there. That shows me, because it would be sitting right there, it doesn't show up there. The vorticity maximum is not there. So it's weak. It's so shallow in the atmosphere that its circulation does not extend up to the 500 millibar field. And if you look at 200 millibars, which is the outflow level, look at that. Fairly strong westerly winds cutting across. Sheer, 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 sheer. Trough carved out there. Little bit of an anticyclone back to the east, or more favorable upper level winds, maybe over Hispaniola, but then that's got mountains 10,000 feet or so. So I don't see 94L doing much at all. If it gets tangled up over the land masses here, it's just never going to have a chance to develop. Now, of course, if this goes north of the islands and stays over the warm water, or well to the south staying over the warm water, and this shear is not here, because you can clearly see these westerly winds here that goes against the system, well, then it might have a different outcome. But according to the data that I'm looking at today, there's nothing that leads me to believe that this is going to end up being a significant system. That can change. Models, the situation, everything can change on a dime. We know that, especially this time of year. But looking at what I have today in front of me tells me that folks in the islands, keep an eye on it, but I don't expect anything significant there. And then farther downstream, same story. Sheer lack of organization, the dry air, you name it, all against this system developing into anything significant. We'll see. Hopefully that'll hold true, and it won't end up being a spoiler for August here, end up being a powerful hurricane somewhere. We don't want to see that. And so far, that looks good. All right, so there's your update for today. Again, the 20th of August. I am Mark Sudduth. HurricaneTrack.com is my website. Check it out sometime if you haven't already. And I'm always glad to do these videos for Hurricane and Hurricane HD, hoping to teach you something. And with that being said, I'll try it again tomorrow.